On a fading evening in ancient Rome, when the streets were weary from war, sickness, and the slow crumbling of empire, there walked a quiet man who longed simply to be a monk in a house of prayer. His name was Gregory. He wished for silence, for cloisters and psalms, for a life hidden from the noise of power. Yet the world, fragile and hurting, would not let him remain hidden. Drawn from his beloved monastery to sit upon the chair of Peter, he became a gentle father to a starving city and a distant shepherd to peoples he would never see. Tonight, as the lamps of history grow soft and dim, we will walk slowly through his story. From noble youth to monk, from reluctant pope to enduring guide of souls, listening to how one man's quiet heart helped steady a world that felt as if it were falling apart. There is a certain kind of silence that falls over a city when its greatness has passed. Not the lively silence of a feast ending or a marketplace closing, but a softer, heavier quiet, as though the walls themselves remember better days. This was the Rome into which Gregory was born, a city that still carried the memory of emperors and triumphs, yet now lived with ruins, with worry, and with the slow, uncertain rhythm of survival. If you could walk its streets in those years, you would see fragments of an older glory everywhere. Tall columns, half broken, stood like tired sentinels. Marble statues, chipped and weathered, gazed out over narrow lanes where grass grew between the stones. The great forums, once crowded with senators and citizens, had become places where goats might wander and children play in the shadow of toppled arches. Rome was still Rome, but its heartbeat had changed. For centuries, this city had ruled an empire stretching from the misty shores of Britain to the deserts of Africa, from the wild forests of the north to the bright cities of the east. Now the empire in the west was gone, dissolved into memories and fragile titles, contested between warlords and distant rulers. New peoples had come, bearing different languages, different customs, and sometimes different faiths. Old roads still led out from the city like veins, but those roads were no longer secure. Brigands and soldiers moved along them, and travelers walked with a wary eye on the horizon. The people who lived in Rome at this time, shopkeepers and monks, widows and soldiers, children and the elderly, woke each day not knowing exactly what would arrive with the next sunrise. Some days brought news of battles fought not far from the city. Some days brought the smell of smoke from burning villages, carried on the wind. Other days brought something more quiet but no less frightening: the slow arrival of plague and famine, of sickness that passed from house to house, of grain ships that did not appear on the river when they were desperately needed. The Tiber, which curled gently around the city, had its moods as well. In times of heavy rain, it rose up in sudden fury, spilling over its banks and flooding neighborhoods where the poor made their homes. Water would seep into walls and foundations, leaving a chill dampness that lingered. When it receded, it left behind mud, debris, and the faint, lingering fear that it might happen again soon. Even the river, which ought to have been a faithful friend carrying food and traders to the city, could become a source of anxiety. Over all this, the church's bells began to take the place of the old empire's trumpet calls. Instead of imperial decrees, papal letters and sermons carried authority. Instead of great public games in the arenas, there were processions and litanies. The steady murmur of psalms chanted morning and evening in the city's churches and monasteries. Rome was learning to be something new, no longer the capital of an empire of armies, but the heart of a quieter, more fragile kind of leadership, one that tried to bind together frightened, scattered peoples with prayer, charity, and the careful keeping of tradition. The people clung to memories. Old men might still remember, if only dimly, the days when the emperor's name was spoken with awe, when roads were patrolled and taxes, though heavy, arrived in an orderly way. Younger generations had never known that world. They had been born into uncertainty. To them, stability and peace were not memories, but stories. But even stories can bring a kind of comfort, especially when they are told by candlelight, in houses where families gather close on cold evenings, listening for any hint that tomorrow might be kinder than today. In these days, rumors traveled quickly. A whisper that a barbarian king was marching south could spread across the city by sunset. A report that the emperor in faraway Constantinople had sent a new official, or that a treaty had been signed, might stir a faint, cautious hope. Yet Rome knew that promises could change, alliances could crumble, and armies could withdraw as quickly as they came. The city had seen too many banners rise and fall to trust easily. And then there was the sickness. Plague did not always arrive with drums and trumpets. It stole in quietly. It started with a few cases: a neighbor's son, a merchant's wife, a monk who had seemed healthy just days before. Then more people fell ill. The streets grew emptier. The sound of carts carrying the sick and the dead could be heard in the early morning. Priests and deacons moved through the city offering prayers and comfort, even as they knew they too might soon be called to depart this life. It was in such a world that Gregory's childhood unfolded, a world where every view contained both beauty and sorrow. He would have seen sunlight catching the tops of ancient monuments, making their worn edges glow with a soft gold. He would also have noticed the weeds pushing through the cracks in once proud pavements, and the faces of beggars at the gates of noble houses. The contrast became part of his imagination. Glory and fragility side by side, the grandeur of the past and the urgent needs of the present sharing the same narrow streets. The church in Rome carried a heavy burden. The Bishop of Rome, whom we now call the Pope, was no longer only a spiritual leader. He had become, in many ways, the father of the city, responsible not just for sacraments and sermons, but for food, for peace, for the delicate negotiations with local rulers and foreign powers. Rome's people turned to the church because there was often nowhere else to turn. When the granaries ran low, they looked to the Pope. When an army approached, they sought the Pope's intercession. When plague spread, they joined behind him in processions of prayer, walking through the streets with candles and tears. According to later traditions, there were nights when visions and stories of angels walking above the city's walls were told in hushed voices, not as loud declarations, but as quiet hopes that heaven had not forgotten this place. Rome felt both abandoned and cherished, a city far from the confident strength of earlier centuries, yet still somehow under the watchful eye of God. The old pagan temples stood, some of them turned into churches, some left to crumble, their meaning slowly changing as new prayers rose where old sacrifices had once been made. The households of the nobility, including that of Gregory's family, lived with a certain tension. They bore the names of ancient Roman lineages, but the world that had made these names illustrious was vanishing. They might still own lands and houses, still hold offices when they were available, but security was elusive. Estates could be ruined by war or taxation, houses damaged by flood or looting, incomes lost as trade routes shifted or failed. Even among the wealthy, there was an awareness that everything in this world could be taken away. In the midst of this uncertainty, monasteries were beginning to appear more frequently. These small islands of prayer and order rose within or near the city, places where monks followed a rhythm that did not depend on the rise and fall of kings. They prayed the Psalms, worked in gardens, copied books, and offered hospitality. Their bells called them to prayer at set hours, marking time not by political events, but by the steady turning of the day from dawn to dusk. To many, such communities seemed like shelters, gentle lights in a city often overshadowed by fear. Gregory would one day love this monastic life deeply, but as a child he first knew the city's more public face, the processions, the stories of wars, the anxious conversations of adults who wondered what would come next. He would have walked past statues whose faces had been worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain, past churches where candles flickered before relics of martyrs, past marketplaces where people haggled over loaves of bread, olives, and fish. Each scene carried its own mixture of normality and unease, as though life itself were determined to continue, even when the foundations seemed insecure. Beyond Rome, the wider world was changing too. Kingdoms rose where provinces had once been. Languages mixed. Soldiers who had once fought against Rome now served as its defenders, or as uneasy neighbors. Embassies traveled between courts, carrying letters, gifts, and requests for alliance. Rome, no longer the heart of an empire, still remained a symbol, a place that other rulers watched, sometimes with suspicion, sometimes with reverence, often with a complicated mix of both. All of this, the ruined splendor, the everyday courage of the poor, the weight carried by the church, the quiet endurance of families, formed the air Gregory breathed. The boy who would one day be called the Great grew up not in a triumphal age, but in a wounded one. This taught him something important, something that would shape his whole life. That leadership was not about shining in times of ease, but about serving faithfully in times of distress. That greatness could be gentle, and authority could be expressed in care for the weak. As evening fell over the city in those years, lamps would be lit in houses and churches, small circles of light appearing in the fading blue of the Roman sky. The voices of people at prayer rose softly, mingling with the distant sounds of animals, the creak of cartwheels, the murmur of families settling in for the night. Somewhere among those houses, a young Gregory listened, watched, and quietly absorbed the lessons of a troubled Rome, a city that seemed both broken and beloved. In that fragile world, where the shadows of past empires lay across the cobblestones, a new kind of hope was being born. Not loud or triumphant, but patient and steady. Gregory's life would grow out of this soil, the soil of a city that had lost much, yet still believed that God could write new stories, even in the midst of ruins. In a city of broken marble and flickering lamps, Gregory's early years unfolded within the walls of a house that carried both weight and memory. His family was of the old Roman aristocracy, the Anici, a name that still held a quiet echo of former glory. Once, such families had filled the Senate, commanded armies, and shaped laws for half the known world. By Gregory's time, these titles and honors did not glitter as they once had, yet they still gave a certain dignity, a sense of responsibility, like an old cloak worn thin but carefully maintained, out of reverence for what it once had been. Gregory's childhood home stood on the Caelian Hill, one of Rome's ancient heights. It may have looked out over gardens and other noble houses, over churches whose bells marked the passing hours, and over the distant crumbling outlines of the city's once grand monuments. Within its walls, life followed a rhythm both ordinary and solemn. Servants came and went, carrying water, preparing meals, tending to daily needs. Relatives and visitors arrived with news, some hopeful, some heavy. At the heart of the household, though, was a family that had learned to see its position not merely as privilege, but as a calling. His father, Gordianus, served the church as a legionary prefect, responsible for the administration of one of the city's districts, and is sometimes described as a man of property and influence. His mother, Sylvia, would later be honored as a saint herself, remembered for her piety and generosity. Between them and other devout relatives, the faith that filled this household was not an ornament, not a polite custom, but something woven into the fabric of daily life. It was there in the prayers before meals, in the alms given discreetly to the poor, in the way guests were welcomed as if Christ himself might be hidden among them. For a child, such an environment shapes the imagination quietly, like water shaping stone. Gregory would have seen his parents' concern for the needy who knocked at the door, their reverence for the clergy who visited, their attentiveness to the liturgy in the city's churches. He would have been told stories of martyrs and monks, of bishops who had guided Rome through earlier storms, of saints whose relics lay beneath the altars where they prayed. The names of Peter and Paul, of Lawrence and Agnes, of countless others who had suffered and prayed within the same city, would not have been distant figures in a book. They were part of the living atmosphere, the unseen company that surrounded him. Education, for a boy of Gregory's status, was serious business. Even in an age of decline, the Roman tradition of learning had not entirely vanished. Tutors would have taught him to read and write Latin with care, to appreciate the elegant turns of phrase in classical authors, and to shape his own words with precision. He would have learned the art of rhetoric, the careful ordering of arguments, the choice of words that could persuade or comfort, the rhythm of speech that could hold an audience's attention. In later years, his sermons and letters would show how deeply this training had taken root. But in childhood, it would have appeared simply as lessons, exercises, words copied on wax tablets or parchment in patient repetition. Yet his education was not only in grammar and rhetoric. The scriptures were central. Gregory would have studied the Psalms, learning to chant or recite them, letting their phrases sink into his memory. The stories of the Old and New Testaments would have been explained to him. Abraham and Moses, David and Isaiah, Mary and Joseph, Peter and Paul. As a boy, he might have sat quietly while an elder read from the Gospels, listening to the parables of Jesus. Seeds scattered in a field, a lost sheep carried on the shepherd's shoulders, a house built upon rock rather than shifting sand. These images would later echo through his writings and sermons, but first they were seeds planted in the mind of a thoughtful child. At times, the contrast between his lessons and the city around him must have been striking. He was learning the language of order, logic, and faith in a world that often seemed disorderly and fragile. Classical texts spoke of strong, stable institutions. Scripture spoke of God's steadfast love and guiding hand. Yet outside the family home, the streets could tell of hunger, fear, and uncertainty. This tension did not drive him to despair. Instead, it seems to have taught him that true wisdom lies not in ignoring suffering, but in facing it with hope, drawing strength from something deeper than shifting political fortunes. The rhythms of the church's feasts and fasts shaped his year. Advent, with its quiet expectation. Christmas, with its joy at the birth of Christ. Lent, with its sober call to repentance. Easter, with its dawn of new life. These cycles would have been observed carefully in a devout household. Gregory would have gone with his family to Mass in the city's churches, joining processions, hearing the chant rise and fall in the heavy air of incense and candlelight. He might have knelt before relics housed beneath altars, aware that others had walked this path before him, had suffered and believed, and now were remembered in prayer. The presence of his relatives also mattered. According to tradition, several members of his family were known for their sanctity, including aunts who embraced religious life. Gregory grew up knowing that holiness was not a distant ideal meant only for a few extraordinary figures. It was something that could be lived quietly within the walls of one's own home, through generosity, humility, and fidelity to prayer. The idea that a household could become almost like a small monastery, a place of ordered devotion, may have begun to form in his mind even then. Outside, the city changed from season to season. Rain fell on the worn stones of the streets, filling the air with a dampness that clung to clothes and walls. During dry months, dust rose underfoot, settling on windowsills and statues. Market days brought color and noise. Other days were muted, with fewer voices, more empty spaces. Gregory, as a boy, would have seen both the bustling life of Rome and its quieter, more desolate corners. Children often notice what adults try to pass over in silence. The beggar sitting in the same place day after day, the boarded-up doorway of a house long abandoned, the weary lines on a laborer's face. Perhaps there were moments when he asked his parents about these things. Why some had so much and others so little. Why the world felt so uncertain. Why God allowed floods, wars, and sickness. The answers he received may not have been complete, but they were surely shaped by a faith that trusted God even in the midst of confusion. In time, he would come to see, and later to teach, that a Christian's response to such questions is not only in words, but in actions, feeding the hungry, comforting the sick, guiding the lost. The seeds of that conviction were planted in these early observations. His tutors might have taken him, as part of his education, to see some of the city's public buildings, to understand its history, its laws, its institutions. He would have looked up at arches engraved with the names of emperors, at columns that told stories in carved relief spiraling upward into the sky. He would have learned of battles won, territories added, triumphal processions that once marched along these same roads. But he would also have seen how the glory of the past did not guarantee the stability of the present. The empire was no longer what it had been. Greatness, he began to understand, must be sought elsewhere. Inside his home, the atmosphere was more stable. Meals were shared at regular times. Lamps were lit as evening approached, casting warm circles of light in rooms where shadows gathered in the corners. Perhaps there were balconies or courtyards where he could look up at the sky, watching the colors change as the sun set behind the hills. In those quiet moments, a thoughtful child might begin to ponder questions of purpose, of what truly matters in a life that can be so fragile. Gregory's mind was sharp, but his heart was also tender. Later accounts of his life show a man deeply moved by the sufferings of others, quick to weep for the sins and sorrows of the world. Such sensitivity does not appear suddenly in adulthood. It usually begins in childhood, in the way a young person responds to stories and events. When he heard of a neighbor's illness or of a distant village struck by hardship, when he walked past a hungry face at the gate, something within him quietly stored these impressions. They did not harden him, they deepened him. The presence of the church was constant. Bishops, priests, and deacons would have been known to his family. In their company, Gregory might have heard discussions about doctrine, about the challenges facing the church, about disputes and reconciliations, about councils and letters traveling between Rome and distant seas. Even if he did not understand all the details as a child, he would have sensed that the church carried a serious and delicate responsibility to preserve truth, to foster unity, to care for souls in times of turmoil. This too shaped his inner world. For all the solemnity around him, there would also have been moments of simple childhood joy. Laughter echoing in the courtyard, games played with other children, curiosity about small things, a bird perched on a wall, the pattern of light and shadow on an old mosaic floor, the sound of distant singing drifting in from a church. These small delights help to root a person in the goodness of life, even when larger events feel threatening. They give the heart a reason to hope and to keep seeking the gentle presence of God in ordinary moments. As Gregory grew, so did his sense of duty. The education he received was not just for his own advancement. It was understood that a young man from his family would likely be called to serve in public life or in the church. He learned discipline, the discipline of study, of respectful speech, of measured action. He was being prepared, quietly and steadily, for responsibilities that neither he nor his teachers could fully foresee. In later years, when he looked back on his life, Gregory would see how much he owed to these early days, to the faith of his mother, to the devotion of his relatives, to the learning instilled by his tutors, to the example of the clergy and monks who crossed his path. He would also see how the brokenness of his world had shaped his understanding of Christian leadership. Growing up in a city of ruins taught him that the true work of a shepherd is not to admire monuments, but to care for living souls, not to cling to fading honors, but to build a quieter, more enduring kingdom in the hearts of the faithful. The boy who studied Latin verse while hearing rumors of war beyond the walls, who chanted psalms while knowing that plague could come at any time, who watched his parents open their doors to the poor and the stranger. That boy was already being formed into the man who would one day guide Rome itself. In the half-light of those early years, the path ahead was not yet clear, but the foundations were being laid, stone by stone, in prayer, study, and quiet acts of charity. In the stillness of evening, as the Caelian hill grew dim and the city settled into its uneasy rest, Gregory's childhood days would draw to a close one after another. Each day left behind traces, a phrase from Scripture remembered, a lesson in grammar mastered, a face of someone in need imprinted on his heart. These traces, gathered over time, would become the guiding lines of his future. Before he was a pope, before he was called the Great, he was simply a boy in a house above a wounded city, learning what it meant to belong to a family, to a church, and to a world that quietly needed his compassion. As Gregory moved from youth into early adulthood, the world around him, with all its uncertainties, began to press more directly upon his life. The days of lessons and observation quietly gave way to days of responsibility. For a young man of noble birth, educated in letters and formed in discipline, the path toward public service was both natural and expected. Rome might be diminished, its old imperial structures worn and fragile, but its administration still needed careful hands. Into this space, Gregory was called. In time, he became prefect of the city of Rome. Praefectus Urbi, one of the highest offices still functioning in the city. The title carried an echo of grandeur from earlier centuries. Prefects had once overseen a bustling capital of empire, managing grain supplies for vast populations, maintaining order in crowded streets, supervising public works and legal affairs in a city alive with commerce and ambition. By Gregory's age, the role was changed, but not empty. It still required vigilance, judgment, and a steady mind amid confusion. We can imagine him, now a young man rather than a boy, walking through the same streets he had known in childhood, only now he did so not as an observer, but as a guardian with real duties. Where once his tutors had explained the workings of Rome's institutions, now he was part of those institutions. Citizens might come to him seeking decisions or interventions, petitions in hand, their voices colored by worry or hope. His signature on a document could bring relief or disappointment. His words in a council could influence how limited resources were distributed, how disputes were resolved, how justice was seen to be done. The office of prefect demanded long, careful days. There were matters of law to consider, cases brought before the city's authorities, conflicts between neighbors, disagreements over property, questions of inheritance and contracts. There were also broader concerns: how to keep the peace in neighborhoods where tensions simmered, how to handle taxes and public revenues in a time when trade could falter, how to respond when news arrived of troop movements or political decisions far away that might soon affect Rome. Gregory's training in rhetoric and grammar, his familiarity with classical texts and with scripture, now found practical expression. He needed to listen attentively, to weigh arguments, to see beyond the surface of complaints. The habit of patient thought, formed in the quiet of studies, served him in crowded offices and public meetings. Yet for all the importance of his position, he knew that he stood in a changing world. The old framework of empire, which had once given a clear shape to Roman public life, had grown fragile. Compromises, negotiations, and a constant awareness of shifting powers were part of his daily reality. There was also the pressure of representing his class. As a member of the old aristocracy, Gregory carried the expectations of his peers. They might hope he would preserve their interests, maintain their honors, and uphold the traditions that had defined their families for generations. At the same time, the church, already central to his life, called him to think more broadly, to see not only noble houses, but also the poor in crowded neighborhoods, the widows and orphans on the margins, the monks and clergy who depended on others' generosity. He stood, in many ways, at a crossroads between older Roman ideals of civic virtue and the Christian vision of service to the least and most vulnerable. Walking through the city in his official capacity, he would have passed by both decaying monuments and living sorrows. He might ride or walk along streets where grass grew in cracks between ancient stones, past forums that were now half empty, past once grand baths with their massive domes, some still in use, others quiet and echoing. At the same time, he would see the faces of those for whom the condition of the city was not an abstract issue, but a daily struggle. The mother trying to secure enough grain for her children, the elderly man who depended on small acts of public charity, the craftsmen whose livelihoods were tied to an uncertain stream of trade and contracts. It was a demanding life, and likely a restless one. The prefect's tasks did not end neatly at sunset. Concerns carried over into the night. Letters needed to be written, reports read, decisions pondered in the dim light of lamps. Visitors arrived with urgent news even at unusual hours. Sleep, when it came, might be shallow, interrupted by thoughts of pending cases, of potential crises, of the ever-present need to balance the city's fragile stability. Yet in the midst of this, something deeper was stirring within Gregory. He had grown up with the example of devout relatives, with the steady rhythm of church feasts and fasts, with stories of monks who had left worldly affairs to live in deliberate simplicity. His heart, formed in prayer and nourished by scripture, did not belong entirely to his office. He performed his duties faithfully, but there remained in him a quiet, persistent longing for something else, a life more hidden, more given to God, less entangled in the complexities of politics and administration. Perhaps, on some evenings after long days in the city's offices, he would return to his family home on the Caelian Hill and pause for a moment at a window or in a courtyard, listening to the distant sounds of chant rising from a church or monastery. The contrast between the noise of public life, the arguments, debates, and anxieties, and the ordered peace of monastic prayer must have been striking. One world demanded that he solve problems, negotiate interests, and make judgments. The other lifted its eyes toward eternal truths, repeated psalms that had outlived empires, and entrusted everything and everyone to God. Gregory's spiritual sensitivity did not make him careless in his duties. On the contrary, it seems to have sharpened his sense of justice and mercy. He knew that every decision affecting grain distribution, tax collection, or public order touched real lives. Christian faith taught him that each person who came before him, whether richly dressed or clothed in rags, was made in the image of God. This awareness likely tempered his judgments, adding compassion to strictness, patience to authority. But even with such a balance, the interior tension remained. The more seriously he took his responsibilities, the more clearly he saw the limits of what public office could achieve. He could arrange for food to be distributed, but he could not eliminate famine. He could punish wrongdoing and settle disputes, but he could not remove sin from the human heart. He could negotiate with earthly powers, but he could not command peace. The world he served was always fragile, always at risk, always in need of something beyond human skill. In that realization, the simplicity of monastic life gained a new brightness in his thoughts. He had heard of men and women who renounced wealth and position to live in prayer, poverty, and community. They did not oversee cities. They tended the inner city of the soul. They did not negotiate treaties. They reconciled hearts to God. Their hours were marked not by reports and petitions, but by the bells that called them to psalms and silence. To a man like Gregory, deeply aware of the brokenness of society and the limits of worldly power, such a life must have appeared not as an escape, but as a more direct way of serving what truly mattered. At the same time, he could not simply abandon his post on a whim. Duty held him. The office had been entrusted to him. People depended on his work. The virtues he had been taught, responsibility, perseverance, fidelity, would not allow him to cast aside his tasks lightly. And yet, under and around this sense of obligation, a call was beginning to form, quiet but insistent, like a steady note sounding beneath the restless music of public life. Imagine him in a meeting, listening as others discuss finances, security, judicial matters. Outwardly, he is attentive, composed, contributing with clarity and insight. Inwardly, however, part of his soul is elsewhere, perhaps recalling a phrase from the Psalms. "One thing have I asked of the Lord, this will I seek after." Those words speak of dwelling in the house of the Lord, of gazing upon the beauty of God, of living in a different kind of service. The contrast between that vision and his daily responsibilities may have sharpened the longing within him. Stories from his later writings suggest that Gregory never forgot the weight of office, nor did he ever despise the secular duties he had once held. He recognized the value of good governance, the importance of just administration, the nobility of service to the common good. Yet he also came to believe that his own path lay elsewhere. The skills he had learned would not be lost. They would later return in a new form when he became a spiritual shepherd. But for the moment, he bore the tension quietly, fulfilling his obligations while listening for God's guidance. There may have been moments when friends or relatives, proud of his position, spoke to him with admiration. They might describe his career as promising, his future as bright in the eyes of the world. Some may have imagined him rising to still greater honors, becoming a central figure in the city's political life. Gregory, hearing such words, would have responded with polite modesty. Inside, however, he was already beginning to see that true greatness for him would not be found in titles or prestige, but in a deeper surrender to the will of God. In that era, when the boundaries between civil and ecclesiastical life were often blurred, it was not uncommon for men of high rank to move from one sphere to the other. Yet for Gregory, the movement would not be a simple career change. It would be a conversion of the heart, a turning away from the visible security of office toward the more hidden security of God's providence. The decision would cost him something, comfort, recognition, influence. But it would also open the way for a life more fully aligned with the quiet desires that had been growing in him since childhood. The time came when Gregory's tenure as prefect drew to a close. The details of how this happened are less clear than the consequences, but we know that he did not cling to his position. Once his service in that role was complete, he was free to follow the deeper call that had been unfolding in his soul. The experience he carried away from public office would remain with him always: an understanding of administration, a closeness to the sufferings of ordinary people, a sense of how fragile and complex human affairs can be. All this would later shape his papacy, giving him a realism and compassion rare in a world of harsh rulers and shifting powers. For now, though, we can picture him stepping away from the official buildings where he had spent so many hours, walking once again through Rome's streets without the weight of the prefect's responsibilities on his shoulders. The same statues, the same worn pavements, the same mixture of beauty and ruin surrounded him. But something within him was shifting. Where others might see only a young man leaving a promising career, Gregory understood that he was turning towards something more hidden and more demanding: the life of a monk, the life of prayer. As evening settled over the city, lamps being lit one by one behind shuttered windows, the young former prefect carried with him both the memory of public office and the quiet hope of a different path. His time in the service of Rome had taught him much about leadership, responsibility, and the needs of the poor. Now those lessons would sink deeper, preparing him for the next chapter of his journey, one in which the house on the Caelian hill would be transformed, and the man who once governed a city would learn to govern himself in the silence of a monastery. There are moments in a life when the path ahead quietly changes direction, not with thunder or sudden flashes of insight, but with a steady, gentle turning of the heart. For Gregory, that turning had been underway for a long time. The prayers of his childhood, the example of his devout family, the contrast between the fragile world of public affairs and the enduring peace he sensed in the church, all of it formed a kind of inner current, guiding him in ways he might not always have been able to put into words. When the season of his public service drew to a close, that current led him toward a choice that would define him more deeply than any office ever could. He had known wealth and status. His family name carried weight, and his position as prefect had placed him at the center of Rome's civic life. Yet the more he saw of the world's honors, the more clearly he understood their limits. Titles could be lost. Fortunes could disappear with a bad harvest, a political reversal, or a flood along the Tiber. Even the admiration of others could change in a moment, replaced by criticism or indifference. Gregory's heart, formed by Scripture, knew the words of Jesus about treasures that do not last, moth and rust and thieves, and about a kingdom not of this world. These words were no longer only passages to be recited. They were becoming a quiet measure by which he weighed his own future. According to tradition, it was in this time that Gregory made a decisive choice: to renounce the life of a Roman nobleman and embrace the simplicity of a monk. This was not a decision made lightly. It meant letting go of comfort, influence, and the familiar patterns of aristocratic life. It meant taking a path that many might not understand, a path that seemed, in worldly terms, like a step down, away from honor and toward obscurity. But Gregory had come to see that the true height of a Christian life was found not in rising above others, but in bowing low before God. One of the most striking aspects of his decision was what he chose to do with his family home on the Caelian Hill. That house, which had witnessed his childhood and his years of early responsibility with its rooms, courtyards, and memories, could have remained a noble villa, a sign of social standing. Instead, he transformed it into a monastery. The place that had once been the center of a worldly household became a house of prayer. Its halls, once filled with the voices of officials and guests, would now echo with the steady rhythm of psalms, day and night. We can pause for a moment and imagine that transformation. The house still stood on its hill, looking out over a city of ruins and churches. The walls were the same, the stones unchanged, yet the very purpose of the space was altered. Perhaps the large reception rooms where visitors had once gathered were rearranged to hold rows of simple beds or places for reading and copying manuscripts. Areas once used for banquets or social gatherings were adapted for meals taken in common, in silence, or with the soft sound of spiritual reading in the background. A space was set aside as an oratory, a small chapel within the house, where the Eucharist would be celebrated and where the monks would assemble to chant the divine office. The rhythm of life within those walls changed as well. Where once there had been the unpredictable comings and goings of public business, now there was a structured day, marked by the bells that called the community to prayer. Before dawn, the monks rose to praise God in the darkness, their voices weaving together words that had been sung by believers for centuries. As the light slowly returned to the sky, illuminating the city below, they moved from psalmody to work, tending gardens, copying texts, performing tasks necessary for the life of the house. Gregory did not merely sponsor this monastery from a distance. He entered it. He set aside the clothes of a nobleman and accepted the habit of a monk. He left behind the formalities of high office and embraced obedience under a superior, living as a brother among brothers. It was a profound reversal, one that he would later describe as the happiest time of his life. The man who had once carried the burdens of civic administration now carried a different, quieter burden: the discipline of prayer, the cultivation of humility, the unceasing effort to align his own will with the will of God. In this monastic life, he discovered what he had long desired: a space where love of God could fill the day from morning to night, where the clamor of earthly concerns was replaced by the steady, ordered sound of psalms, readings, and shared silence. The city outside remained troubled, with its political uncertainties and material needs. But within the monastery, Gregory found a small, stable world oriented entirely toward the eternal. The discipline of the community was firm, yet gentle. They rose at set hours, recited the offices, and engaged in manual labor. Some tended the small gardens that provided vegetables and herbs for the monastery's table, caring for the soil and watching plants grow in quiet patience. Others worked in the scriptorium, copying texts on parchment with careful strokes, preserving the wisdom of Scripture and earlier Christian writers. Each task, no matter how simple, was seen as part of a larger offering, an act of worship performed in the presence of God. For Gregory, who had known the complexity of civil administration, this simplicity did not feel like a narrowing, but like a deepening. Where once his attention had been divided among many urgent matters, now it could be focused on the one thing necessary. He could meditate on Scripture for long stretches, pondering each phrase, letting it shape his understanding and his heart. He could listen to the chant of the Psalms and feel within them not only the voice of ancient Israel, but also the cry of his own age, its fears, its hopes, its need for mercy. Yet even in this quiet life, the world did not entirely vanish from his thoughts. Gregory's compassion did not stop at the cloister walls. The monastery, like many others, was a place of hospitality. Travelers, the poor, and those in need might come to its door seeking food, shelter, or counsel. Gregory, shaped by his upbringing and former office, understood that charity was a central part of the Christian calling. The same heart that had once cared for Rome as prefect now cared for the stranger, the pilgrim, the suffering neighbor, but in a more personal, immediate way. There is a delicate balance in monastic life between withdrawal and service, between solitude and hospitality. Gregory navigated this balance with care. He loved the silence of the cloister, the ordered hours of prayer, the hiddenness of a life quietly offered to God. At the same time, he knew that this hidden life was meant to radiate outward, to support the wider church not only through intercession, but through concrete acts of kindness. The monastery on the Caelian Hill became, under his influence, a place where both dimensions, contemplation and charity, found a home. This period also allowed Gregory's spiritual gifts to mature. Freed from the daily demands of civic responsibility, he was able to devote more time to study. He read scripture intensely, but also the works of earlier fathers of the church. He meditated on Augustine, whose thought would mark him deeply, and on other voices who had tried to understand how God's grace moves within human history. In the quiet of his cell, he was not merely gathering information. He was allowing these texts to question him, to shape his understanding, to draw him into a more profound trust in God's providence. Monastic life is not free from struggle. Temptations of pride, impatience, and discouragement can arise in the most peaceful cloisters. Gregory was keenly aware of this. He understood that leaving the world did not automatically remove the inner battle. Instead, it often made it more visible. In the stillness, thoughts and memories came to the surface more clearly. Regrets from the past, anxieties about the future, moments of self-doubt. Yet he also discovered that these struggles could become occasions of growth, if met with prayer, humility, and honest self-examination. According to later accounts, Gregory practiced austerities with seriousness, embracing fasting and other forms of self-denial. These were not driven by a harsh view of the body, but by a desire to free his heart from attachments that might draw him away from God. He wanted to love God and neighbor with an undivided mind, and that required a certain simplicity. Fewer possessions, fewer distractions, fewer ambitions tied to this world's changing fortunes. The monastery gave him a framework in which to pursue this simplicity, supported by the presence and example of his brothers. As the seasons turned on the Caelian Hill, Gregory's former life as a nobleman and prefect slowly receded into the distance, though its lessons remained. The vines in the garden budded, grew heavy with leaves, and then grew bare again. The city below experienced its cycles of hardship and small recoveries. In the monastery, the chants continued, steady and unhurried, like a river always flowing, regardless of the surface weather. If visitors remembered Gregory's earlier status, they now saw a man whose authority had taken on a different shape, the quiet authority of holiness beginning to ripen. It is said that he longed to remain in this hidden life indefinitely. In the monastery, he found his true home. The man who had once carried Rome's administrative burdens now considered himself simply a monk among monks, a brother who sought God in the ordinary duties of each day. He cherished the obscurity, the freedom from public recognition. The thought that he might once again be drawn into broader responsibilities did not attract him. It troubled him. In his heart, he had chosen the better part, and he wished to keep it. Still, God's ways with souls are often gentle but unexpected. The very qualities that made Gregory a good monk, his depth of prayer, his wisdom, his compassion, his ability to govern himself, were the same qualities that others in the church began to notice. They saw in him not just a former official who had renounced the world, but a man whose training and holiness could serve the wider community. The monastery had not erased his gifts, it had refined them, and in time, the church would call upon those gifts again, in ways that would require him to leave the quiet cloister he so loved. For the moment, though, on the Caelian Hill, Gregory lived the life his heart had long desired. A life measured not by public acclaim, but by the steady turning of the hours of prayer, not by the noise of political debate, but by the soft, unhurried cadence of psalms, not by the anxiety of governing a restless city, but by the peaceful labor of seeking the face of God. The house of his family had become a house of God. The young aristocrat had become a monk, and in the hiddenness of that transformation, a new chapter of his story quietly took root, ready in time to blossom into a form of leadership he had never sought, yet would accept with trembling obedience. There are seasons in a person's life when two different worlds seem to overlap, like two images slightly out of focus, one on top of the other. For Gregory, this happened when the church called him out of the quiet of his monastery and sent him to a distant city whose very name suggested a different kind of grandeur. Constantinople, the eastern capital of the empire, the city of emperors and councils, of shining domes and elaborate ceremonies. He went not as a nobleman or prefect, but as a deacon, a servant of the church. And yet the purpose of his journey was deeply diplomatic. The Pope at the time, Pelagius II, needed a representative in the imperial court. Rome, weary and vulnerable, looked to Constantinople with a mixture of dependence and disappointment, hoping for protection against invading peoples, especially the Lombards, and yet often receiving only partial help. Gregory, with his experience in administration, his intelligence, and his deep faith, seemed a natural choice to act as bridge between these two worlds, the troubled West and the more ordered, though still fragile, East. Leaving the Caelian Hill, he knew he was stepping away from the life he loved. The monastery, with its steady chant and gentle labor, had become the place where his soul could breathe. Now, in obedience, he had to exchange that rhythm for the bustle of a great city and the calculated politeness of imperial corridors. The journey itself would have been long, taking him across land and sea, through landscapes he had never seen, under skies that shifted from the softer light of Italy to the clearer brightness of the East. When he arrived in Constantinople, the contrast with Rome must have been sharp. Rome, though still impressive in its ancient bones, was a city of ruins and memories. Constantinople, by comparison, seemed young and vigorous, its walls strong, its palaces active, its streets filled with signs of an empire that still held power. The great church of Hagia Sophia, with its vast dome and shimmering mosaics, rose at the heart of the city like a visible symbol of imperial Christianity. Processions moved with careful splendor, and the emperor's presence could be felt in ceremonies and decrees that shaped the life of distant provinces. Gregory took up his role in this place as the apocrisiarius, the papal envoy. It was a position both delicate and demanding. He had to represent the interests of Rome before the emperor and his officials, to explain the city's needs, to plead its cause in times of danger. He had to listen to discussions about theology and policy, about military campaigns and complex church disputes. He was not simply a spectator. He was expected to speak, to write, to negotiate, to carry back to Rome a clear picture of what the imperial court would and would not do. And yet, beneath the surface of these responsibilities, Gregory remained a monk. He lived with a small community of companions, maintaining as far as possible the habits of prayer and study that had formed him on the Caelian Hill. Their lodging in Constantinople became a kind of little monastery within the city, a quieter corner where the psalms were still chanted and scripture still pondered, even as the noise of politics and court life flowed around them like a restless sea. In this setting, Gregory's inner longing for silence did not disappear. If anything, it grew sharper. The contrast between the ordered humility of monastic life and the often tangled ambitions of imperial politics weighed heavily on him. He could see, with the clarity of someone who had tasted both worlds, how fragile human plans could be, how quickly alliances shifted, how easily spiritual concerns could be overshadowed by the pressing demands of power. There were theological tensions as well. The Church in the East and the Church in the West, though united in faith, did not always speak with one voice on every issue. Disputes about language, emphasis, and certain doctrines had arisen over time. Gregory, as envoy, had to navigate these currents with care, holding firmly to the faith of Rome while seeking to maintain peace and mutual respect. He listened to debates, read documents, and engaged with bishops and theologians who came from different traditions and cultures, all while trying to keep his own heart anchored in the simplicity of the gospel. At times, he must have felt the weight of representing not only a distant city, but also its suffering people. Rome, invaded and threatened, looked to Constantinople for military aid. Gregory did what he could. He pleaded, explained, argued gently, wrote letters that expressed the urgency of the situation. Yet the empire had its own troubles, its own frontiers to defend, its own complex calculations. Help was slow, partial, constrained by larger strategic concerns. Gregory experienced firsthand the limits of diplomacy, the way compassionate words could be met with polite promises that did not always become actions. In the midst of this, he did not lose hope, but he learned a kind of sober realism. The world could not be saved by politics alone. Emperors, however powerful, could not guarantee peace. The Church could and should ask for assistance, but its ultimate trust had to rest in God, who sees beyond the shifting patterns of human decisions. Gregory's time in Constantinople deepened his conviction that prayer and holiness were not secondary to public affairs. They were essential foundations, without which no administration, however skillful, could bear lasting fruit. His longing for the Caelian hill often surfaced in his thoughts. He remembered the quiet courtyard, the gentle sound of sandals on stone floors, the steady murmur of psalms in the chapel. In Constantinople, he had liturgy and prayer, but they were surrounded by the glitter and tension of a great capital. He longed for the simplicity of a life where the only real court was the presence of God in the tabernacle, where the only audience that mattered was the listening ear of the Lord. According to some later accounts, Gregory was not particularly impressed by the theological subtlety of certain debates at court. He saw how easily people could become attached to prestige, titles, and distinctions within the church itself. Pride could creep in, even under the appearance of piety. This awareness did not make him cynical, but it did sharpen his sense of the need for humility. He began to reflect more deeply on the kind of shepherd the church needed, one who would not be carried away by honors, but who would stand close to the poor, keep watch over doctrine without harshness, and live in continual remembrance of his own weakness. Meanwhile, Gregory's role as a teacher of his own small community continued. The monks who lived with him in Constantinople looked to him not only as a fellow traveler, but as a guide in scripture and spiritual life. He helped them interpret difficult passages, answered their questions, and encouraged them to remain faithful to their monastic vocation, even in a bustling, unfamiliar city. The experience of guiding others in this way would later shape his writings, especially his reflections on pastoral care. In his quiet moments, perhaps in the evening, when the city grew a little less busy and the light softened along the roofs, Gregory would return to the scriptures, as to a well of clear water. He read the prophets, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, the Psalms that had always been his companions. In their lines he saw reflected not only the world of ancient Israel, but also his own world. The anxieties of rulers, the suffering of peoples, the temptations of wealth and power, the call to trust in God even when human supports seemed uncertain. It is said that in Constantinople he also began to compose and reflect in ways that would bear fruit later. His mind did not rest idly. It worked, turning over what he saw and heard, comparing it with the truths of faith, testing it against the humility and charity demanded by Christ. The diplomat's experience and the monk's contemplation met in him, creating a kind of inner dialogue between the demands of the moment and the eternal word that does not pass away. The years he spent in the East were not wasted or extraneous. They were a necessary part of his formation. They taught him how distant powers think and act, how fragile agreements can be, how important patience is when dealing with complex situations. They also confirmed his insight that no earthly structure, however grand, could replace the simple, faithful service of a pastor who truly loves his flock. Constantinople's splendor only made clearer, by contrast, the quiet beauty of a life poured out in humble care for souls. Eventually, the time came for Gregory to return to Rome. When his mission in Constantinople ended, he left behind the city of domes and palaces, the echoing halls of imperial audiences, the intricate conversations about aid, doctrine, and policy. He carried back with him letters, experience, and a heart that had been both stretched and purified by the demands of his role. On the journey home, perhaps as the ship moved slowly over the water, or as he traveled along familiar roads once more, the outline of Rome would have risen again in his thoughts. The Caelian Hill, the monastery he had left in obedience, the brothers whose faces he still remembered in prayer. He returned not as the same man who had departed. The monk who had been sent abroad to act as a diplomat came back more deeply convinced than ever that his true place was in the hidden life of prayer and service. Yet he also understood, more clearly now, the vastness of the Church's mission and the weight that lay upon the shoulders of its leaders. He had seen the distance between hope and help, between promise and fulfillment. He had learned to lean more heavily on God, and to see in every office, whether civil or ecclesiastical, an opportunity not for self-importance, but for humble service. When Gregory stepped once again onto the stones of Rome, the city was still vulnerable, still poor, still in need. But in his heart, the longing for silence and the call to serve had begun to intertwine in a new way. He desired the cloister, yet he knew that obedience might call him once more into positions he had not sought. The years in Constantinople had prepared him for that possibility, even as they had deepened his love for the hidden life. Soon, the quiet of the Caelian Hill would welcome him again. The bells of the monastery would ring as they had before, calling him back to the Psalms, to the garden, to the familiar corridors of prayer. But the memory of Constantinople, with its splendor and its sorrows, would stay with him like a distant echo. It would remind him, in the years to come, that the Church's heart beats in many places, under many roofs, in cities both broken and strong, and that a true shepherd must carry them all in his prayers, even when he longs simply to be a monk in a house of God. There are times when a person's deepest desire seems very simple: to be left in a small, quiet corner of the world, to live in faithfulness without being noticed. Gregory, back in his monastery on the Caelian Hill after his years in Constantinople, believed that his path was now clear. He had tasted once more the life he loved, the ordered hours of prayer, the gentle discipline of community, the steady work of study and service. The world outside was still complicated and troubled, but within the cloister, he could offer his life in a way that felt whole and undivided. Rome, however, had a way of drawing certain souls back into its public struggles, even when they wished to remain hidden. The city at this time was in deep distress. Floods had damaged buildings and supplies. Famine threatened the poor. Disease, particularly plague, had once again cast its shadow over the population, taking lives swiftly and unpredictably. The Lombards pressed in from outside, and the distant emperor's protection was uncertain. In such a world, the role of the Pope was not an honor to be coveted, but a burden to be feared. To sit in that chair meant to carry the anxieties of an entire people. When Pope Pelagius II died, likely in the midst of a plague that ravaged the city, Rome found itself in a state of mourning and uncertainty. The bishop, who had been a visible sign of stability and fatherhood to the faithful, was gone. The clergy, the nobles, and the people looked around for a successor, someone who could combine spiritual depth with practical wisdom, someone who knew both the needs of the poor and the complexities of dealing with distant powers. Their thoughts turned again and again to the monk on the Caelian hill, Gregory. Word would have reached the monastery in the midst of its usual rhythm. Perhaps during one of the liturgical hours, as the community chanted the Psalms, a messenger came to the door. Perhaps there were quiet conversations afterward, the prior or other leaders sharing the news in careful tones. Eventually, the reality could no longer be kept at a distance. The city wanted Gregory as its bishop. His name was being spoken not in whispers, but in serious discussions among clergy and laity alike. The qualities that had led the church to send him as envoy to Constantinople, the wisdom and humility that had deepened in his monastic years, all of this made him the natural choice in many eyes. For Gregory himself, the news was heavy. He did not greet it with eagerness. The thought of leaving the cloister again, and this time not for a temporary mission but for a permanent office, must have grieved him. He knew very well what the papacy required: sleepless nights, difficult decisions, constant care for the suffering, painful negotiations with political powers, and the ever-present fear of failing souls entrusted to him. He had written, thought, and prayed about pastoral care. Now the church was asking him not only to teach about it, but to live it at the highest and most demanding level. He resisted. Tradition tells that Gregory tried, in various ways, to avoid his election. Some stories, colored by the affection of later generations, speak of him even attempting to hide or delay the process. Whether every detail of these tales is exact or not, they reflect a deeper truth. His reluctance was real. He did not see the papacy as a crown to be worn, but as a cross to be embraced. The more he understood its weight, the more fearful he became. Not out of cowardice, but out of humility. He knew his own weaknesses. He knew that shepherding souls is a task that no human being can perform well without constant grace. Yet the voices around him did not fall silent. The clergy of Rome insisted. The people supported the choice. Even the memory of Pelagius II's trust in him, shown in the earlier appointment to Constantinople, now seemed like a kind of preparation for something greater. The church's need stood before him like an insistent plea. Rome was a flock without a shepherd. Widows, orphans, the sick, the hungry, the frightened, all needed someone to stand in the place of Peter, to feed them with the word of God and with the bread of charity. The process of papal election in those days was slower and more fragile than in later centuries. Communications with Constantinople were needed. The emperor's confirmation was often sought. Meanwhile, the city continued to suffer. Gregory, caught in the tension between his monastic longing and the church's call, prayed. In the darkness of the monastery chapel, before the flickering lamps and the silent cross, he would have poured out his heart to God. He asked, no doubt, to be spared this office. He also asked for the grace to accept God's will, whatever it might be. In these prayers, we can imagine him recalling the examples of earlier bishops and saints, men who had tried to flee from positions of authority and yet had been brought back by obedience and necessity. He would have remembered Augustine, reluctantly made Bishop of Hippo, and Ambrose, suddenly chosen as bishop before even being baptized. He would have thought of the Apostle Peter himself, a fisherman called away from his nets to become a shepherd of souls. Their stories did not erase his fear, but they showed him that God often chooses those who feel small and inadequate. At last, Gregory yielded. Not because the office had become less frightening, but because he saw in the insistence of the Church a sign of God's will. Obedience was a central virtue in his monastic life. Now it was being asked of him on a larger scale. He would obey the voice of the Church as he had obeyed the voice of his abbot. The day came when his election as Bishop of Rome was confirmed, and the monastery on the Caelian hill, which had been his refuge, became the place from which he was sent out once more, this time not to return. The scene of his consecration, though the details are not precisely recorded, can be gently imagined. The basilica, likely St. Peter's or one of the great churches of the city, was filled with clergy and faithful. Candles burned, casting a warm, steady light on worn stones and solemn faces. Outside, the world remained uncertain. Famine, plague, and the threat of invasion did not pause for ceremonies. Inside, however, time seemed to slow as the church entrusted itself to a new shepherd. Gregory entered not as a confident ruler claiming his place, but as a monk with a trembling heart. The vestments placed upon him, the signs of episcopal authority, the pallium, the staff, the ring, were not ornaments in his eyes, but reminders of responsibility. Each piece of liturgical clothing spoke to him of service, of being bound to the church, of guiding the flock, of fidelity to the bride of Christ. As hands were laid upon him, and prayers for the Holy Spirit's guidance rose from the assembly, he likely felt both the weight of his own insufficiency and the mysterious strength that comes when God calls a person beyond their fear. After his consecration, when the formalities were done and the crowd slowly dispersed, Gregory's real work began. The monk pontiff, as he has sometimes been called, did not cease to be a monk. He brought the spirit of the cloister into the papacy. His first instinct was not to imitate the grandeur of past rulers, but to continue living as simply as possible, to pray with intensity, and to see his role as service rather than status. The Caelian Hill Monastery remained dear to him, and he would draw from its community support and collaborators for his new tasks. Gregory saw himself as a servant of the servants of God, a phrase he used to describe the papal office, not as a beautiful slogan, but as a deep conviction. He did not see the Bishop of Rome primarily as a lord over others, but as one who must stoop lower, caring for those whom everyone else overlooked. His reluctance to become pope had sharpened his sense of humility. He knew that any authority he held must be exercised in gentleness and mercy, for he himself stood always in need of mercy. Still, the inner longing for silence did not vanish. Throughout his years as pope, Gregory would often recall, in his writings and letters, the sweetness of monastic life, the peace of the cloister. He felt at times like a man who had been taken from the quiet harbor and placed again upon a stormy sea. Yet even in that image, there was hope. The stormy sea was precisely where a shepherd was needed, to steer the ship of the church, to encourage weary sailors, to keep watch over the horizon. His love for monastic seclusion did not lead him to neglect his duties. Rather, it constantly reminded him of the goal toward which all his efforts were directed, the eternal rest of souls in God. In the evenings, when the business of the day, meetings, letters, decisions about food distribution and defenses, pastoral visits, and liturgical celebrations came to an end, Gregory would retire, perhaps for a brief time of quiet. The city outside still groaned under its burdens. The Tiber might murmur in the distance. Somewhere, a family wept over a loved one lost to illness. Elsewhere, a soldier kept watch at a gate. The Pope, once a silent monk, now held all these lives in his heart, offering them to God with words that only he and the Lord could hear. His reluctant acceptance of the papacy became, over time, a profound gift to the Church. Because he had not sought the office, he did not use it to seek himself. Because he had known the joy of obscurity, he could stand in the light of public responsibility without being dazzled. Because he had lived as a monk, he understood that every administrative act must be rooted in prayer. The very reluctance that had made him fear the papacy made him, in the end, a gentle and wise shepherd. Gregory's story, at this turning point, is not the tale of a man who abandoned his true calling for the sake of power. It is the story of a man whose true calling was deeper than any single setting could contain. As a monk, he had given himself to God in quietness. As Pope, he would give himself to God in noise and difficulty. The same heartbeat beneath both roles, a heart that wanted to serve, to heal, to teach, to lift the eyes of a wounded people toward a hope that no plague, famine, or invasion could destroy. On the Caelian hill, the monastery continued to chant the Psalms. In the Lateran and at St. Peter's, the Pope now chanted them too, his voice woven into the larger voice of the Church. The path he had not chosen for himself had become the path by which God would use him to steady Rome and to influence lands far beyond its walls. The quiet monk had become the Bishop of Rome, not by ambition, but by obedience. And in that obedience, a new chapter of service opened, one that would leave a gentle, enduring mark on the history of the Church. When Gregory took up the burden of the papacy, he did not inherit a peaceful, well-ordered city. He received instead a wounded Rome, a place where fear sat at many tables, where the future felt thin and uncertain. The stories of his pontificate are not set against a backdrop of calm. They unfold amid hunger, illness, and the constant threat of violence. It was in this setting that Gregory's heart as a shepherd became most visible, not in grand gestures, but in steady, compassionate care for those who suffered most. The first enemy he faced was not an army at the gates, but famine. Years of poor harvests, floods, and the disruption of trade had left Rome's food supplies dangerously fragile. Grain stores that should have lasted through difficult seasons were depleted, and the arrival of grain from distant estates, especially from Sicily, which was under papal control, became a matter of life and death. Hungry faces were everywhere, women lining up with baskets, children whose eyes had grown too serious too early, elderly men who walked with slow, careful steps, conserving their strength. Gregory did not stand apart from this crisis, issuing instructions from a distance. He saw the Church's properties and income not as possessions to be guarded, but as resources entrusted to him for the sake of the poor. The patrimony of Peter, that collection of lands and revenues belonging to the Roman See, was, in his mind, a treasure with only one true purpose: to support the needy, to feed the hungry, to sustain the Church's work. He organized distribution of grain with great care. Letters from his hand reveal a man who monitored the flow of supplies, who demanded honesty and fairness from those managing the Church's estates. who rebuked greed and negligence. He wanted no delay, no unnecessary obstacles between the food in the granaries and the mouths that needed it. To him, the administration of these resources was not mere bookkeeping. It was an act of mercy. Each sack of grain, carefully counted and sent, was a gesture of Christ-like love to bodies weakened by hunger. We can imagine the days when distributions took place. People gathering near the designated places, some arriving before dawn to secure a place in line, others helped along by children or neighbors. Clerics and stewards, acting under Gregory's orders, would oversee the handing out of bread or grain. In the background of such scenes, the Pope himself perhaps moved quietly, observing, making sure that the frail and the forgotten were not pushed aside. If he could not be physically present every time, his spirit was there, expressed through ordinances that insisted on compassion over efficiency, on care for the weakest before all. The famine was not the only darkness. There was also the plague, that silent, invisible enemy that slipped into homes unannounced. It had already taken Pope Pelagius II, and it continued to claim lives throughout Gregory's own pontificate. The signs were horrifying in their simplicity. A fever that did not break, a cough that deepened, sudden weakness, the rapid decline of someone who had seemed healthy only days before. Streets that had once echoed with the noise of daily life could grow suddenly quiet when the sickness passed through, leaving behind shuttered doors and mourning families. Gregory did not respond to this with cold statistics or resigned acceptance. He saw in every victim a person whose life mattered to God, and he believed that the proper response to such suffering was both practical and spiritual. Practically, he encouraged care for the sick, support for the bereaved, almsgiving to those whose livelihoods had been shattered. Spiritually, he turned to prayer with a fervor that marked the entire city. One of the most remembered scenes from his life is a procession he organized during a time of intense plague. According to tradition, he called the people of Rome to gather and walk through the streets in penitence and supplication, carrying icons, singing litanies, asking God's mercy upon a city that seemed close to despair. The faithful moved together, forming 7 processions from different churches, eventually converging, their voices weaving a plea for forgiveness and healing. The air would have been thick with incense, with the sound of chanting, with the muffled steps of thousands walking slowly over worn stones. In these litanies, Gregory's pastoral heart was heard clearly. He did not blame the suffering on distant, abstract causes. He invited the people to see themselves, humbly, as sinners in need of mercy, and at the same time as beloved children who could confidently ask their Father for help. The words they prayed did not try to erase the reality of the plague. They brought it, in all its pain, into the presence of God. According to a cherished tradition, as the procession neared the old mausoleum of Hadrian, later known as the Castel Sant'Angelo, Gregory saw a vision, the archangel Michael sheathing his sword, a sign that the time of punishment was ending and that God's mercy was being poured out upon the city. Whether this scene unfolded exactly as later generations pictured it, or whether it condenses a deeper spiritual truth, the message is gentle and enduring. Even in the darkest hours, heaven was not indifferent to Rome's suffering. The image of the sword being put away captured the hope that the plague would recede, and that God's compassion remained near. But Gregory's care for the people went far beyond such dramatic moments. His daily work as Pope was filled with small acts of attention to the poor and the vulnerable. He instructed his clergy that the Church's wealth belonged first to those in need. He organized diaconies, centers of charity across the city, where the hungry and sick could receive assistance. It is said that he kept a list of the poor and personally saw to it that they were provided with food. In some accounts, He even ate his meals with a sense that the poor were invisibly present at his table, sharing in what he received. Stories arose of his kindness, some perhaps embellished with time, yet all reflecting a truth about his character. One tale speaks of him welcoming a stranger to his table, only to realize that the guest was no ordinary visitor but a heavenly messenger. Another tells of his insistence that no one who came to the doors of the church for food should be turned away. Whether taken as literal events or as symbols, these stories underline how closely Gregory identified Christ with the poor who stood before him. He remembered the Lord's words, "Whatever you did for one of the least of these, you did for me." His letters reveal how seriously he took the discipline of those responsible for distributing charity. If a local bishop or manager of church lands failed to care for the poor, Gregory did not remain silent. He wrote with firmness, reminding them that their role was not to accumulate wealth, but to steward it as a sacred trust. He did not shy away from correcting those who acted harshly or greedily. In his mind, negligence in charity was not merely a practical failure. It was a spiritual wound, a betrayal of the gospel itself. At the same time, Gregory understood that care for the suffering was not only about material relief. Souls, too, were wounded by fear, by grief, by sin. As plague and famine ravaged Rome, many people wrestled with questions about God's presence. Why were these things happening? Had they been abandoned? Was there any hope that life could be good again? Gregory responded with words of consolation and challenge, preaching and writing in a way that acknowledged the depth of pain while pointing beyond it to a larger hope. He spoke of this world as a place of pilgrimage, a journey in which Christians should not expect complete security. The very fragility of life was, in his view, a reminder that the heart must not cling too tightly to earthly comforts. Yet he did not use this thought to diminish suffering or to tell people to simply endure. He insisted that, in the midst of trials, they were called to grow in charity, to support one another, to weep with those who weep, and to rejoice with those who rejoice. The community of believers was meant to be a shelter, not only in physical terms, but emotionally and spiritually, a place where no one had to carry their burdens alone. Gregory's own health was not strong. He suffered from illnesses, particularly pains that plagued him in his later years. He knew fatigue, discomfort, and weakness from the inside. This personal frailty gave him a gentle understanding of others' ailments. When he wrote about patience in suffering, he did so not as a man observing from a distance, but as someone who had learned, slowly and sometimes painfully, how to offer his own pain to God. This made his empathy all the more real. He did not speak down to the afflicted. He stood beside them. In his homilies on the Gospels and his reflections on the book of Job, Gregory described the mysteries of suffering with realism and tenderness. He did not pretend to solve every question. Instead, he invited his listeners to trust in a God who brings good even from tragedy, who purifies hearts through trials, and who never abandons those who call upon him. When he spoke of Christ, it was as one who had himself suffered, who had known hunger, fatigue, and the loneliness of the cross. The Lord was not far from Rome's pain. He was intimately present within it. Rome slowly absorbed Gregory's way of seeing. The people came to know him not as a distant administrator, but as a father whose door stood open, whose heart remained close to their wounds. He walked through streets marked by loss, and yet he tried, with every letter and every act of charity, to plant small seeds of hope. A piece of bread given to a hungry child, a word of counsel offered to a grieving widow, a letter sent to a distant bishop urging greater compassion. Each of these acts was like lighting a small candle against the city's shadows. The Lombards, too, added to the city's anxiety. Their presence in Italy meant that Rome lived under the constant possibility of siege or attack. In this, Gregory's care extended beyond Rome's walls. He negotiated with Lombard leaders, sought to prevent violence, and worked tirelessly to protect not only his own city, but other towns and villages that lay in harm's way. His diplomacy was not separate from his charity. It was one more way of caring for the lives entrusted to him. Peace, when he could secure it, was itself a gift of mercy. Through all of this, famine, plague, threats of war, Gregory remained anchored in prayer. Each day, amid administrative tasks and pastoral visits, he returned to the Psalms, to the liturgy, to the silent gaze before the altar. In that space of stillness, he carried the faces and names of the suffering into the presence of God. His strength did not come from his own resources. It flowed from that hidden conversation with the one he served. In the evenings, as the city slowly quieted and the sky above Rome shifted from the pale gold of late afternoon to the deeper blues of night, Gregory's day of service would draw to a pause. Yet in the hearts he had touched, through food given, through words spoken, through prayers whispered, his care continued to live. He had become, in truth, a shepherd of a wounded city, not a hero shining above it, but a gentle presence moving within it, sharing its hardships, lifting its gaze, reminding it softly that even amid hunger, illness, and fear, it was held in the hands of God. The memory of his pontificate would endure not because he presided over a time of visible success, but because he loved a suffering people with patient, persevering affection. In a world where many leaders sought glory, Gregory sought to be a servant. In a city haunted by ruin, he worked quietly to build something more enduring than stone, a community of faith, mercy, and hope, one act of care at a time. 8. A pastor to the whole world, missions, especially to the Anglo-Saxons, and Gregory's vision of evangelization. From the windows of Rome, Gregory could see a city bruised by famine and plague, watching the movements of nearby armies, measuring each season by its hardships and small mercies. Yet his heart did not rest only on the hills and streets he could see. As Pope, his gaze stretched outward, far beyond the crumbling walls, along old roads and across the sea, toward peoples whose names were strange to Latin ears, whose customs were different, whose faith was still unformed or mingled with older beliefs. In Gregory, the monk's love of a single cloister and the shepherd's concern for the whole flock of Christ came together in a quiet but wide-reaching vision. He did not see the church as confined to familiar lands. The gospel, in his mind, was a light meant to travel, to find its way into distant valleys and across gray, wind-swept coasts. The world of his time seemed fragmented. Empires changed, borders shifted, new kingdoms rose from the remnants of older ones. But beneath these movements, he sensed a deeper continuity. Christ remained the same, and the call to share his message still sounded with gentle urgency. Gregory's letters and actions show us a man who believed that no people were too far, too rough, or too newly settled in their ways to be touched by the patient work of grace. Among all the peoples who drew his attention, the Anglo-Saxons held a special place. They lived far to the northwest, in lands once part of the Roman Empire but now shaped by new kings and warlike tribes. To many in Rome, these distant islanders were little more than a rumor. Tall, fair-haired warriors, fierce in battle, given to customs and gods unfamiliar to the Mediterranean mind. Yet Gregory, according to a beloved tradition, saw something more. The story is often told that before he became pope, Gregory once passed through a Roman marketplace and noticed some young slaves, fair in complexion and hair, offered for sale. Curious, he asked from where they came. "From the island of Britain," he was told, from a people called Angles. The story continues that Gregory, moved by a kind of gentle wordplay and a deeper compassion, replied that they were not Angles, but should be called angels, if only they would turn their hearts to Christ. Whether the exact words were spoken in that way or not, the tale preserves a truth. Even as a monk, Gregory felt a quiet ache for distant peoples who did not yet know the consolation of the gospel. Years later, when he sat in the chair of Peter, that early impression ripened into action. Rome might be fragile, but Gregory believed that the church must never close in upon itself. And so, with patience and care, he prepared a mission to the Anglo-Saxons, choosing monks from his own beloved monastery on the Caelian hill to carry the message of Christ to those distant shores. At their head he placed Augustine, a prior in the community, a man Gregory trusted not only for his discipline, but for his gentleness. The moment when Augustine and his companions set out must have been both solemn and tender. They were monks, accustomed to the rhythm of familiar walls and familiar voices. Now they were to leave those safe routines behind, to cross land and sea, to stand among a people whose language they did not know, whose habits might seem harsh or strange, whose response to the gospel was uncertain. Gregory, sending them forth, felt deeply the cost of their obedience. He loved his monks as brothers. He was not sending out soldiers, but sons in the faith. The journey was difficult. Tradition tells that Augustine and his companions, overwhelmed by the reports they heard of the dangers ahead, grew afraid and hesitated, sending back word to Gregory that perhaps the mission should be abandoned. The Anglo-Saxons sounded fierce. The distance felt immense. The task seemed beyond them. In that moment, Gregory's pastoral heart showed itself with particular clarity. He wrote back not with irritation, but with encouragement, urging them to trust not in their own strength, but in the one who had called them. His letter, remembered and copied in later centuries, carries the tone of a father speaking to anxious children. He reminds Augustine that the greater the difficulties, the greater the grace that God gives to those who persevere. A shepherd, he suggests, does not retreat when the path grows rough. Rather, he leans more heavily on the staff of God's help. Gregory's words did not erase the dangers, but they placed them in a new light, as part of a journey guided by a hand stronger than fear. Strengthened by this, Augustine and his companions resumed their path. When they finally reached the land of the Anglo-Saxons, it was not with armies or displays of power, but with the quiet presence of men who prayed, who sang, who lived together in simplicity. They approached King Ethelbert of Kent, whose kingdom lay in the southeastern part of what we now call England. According to tradition, Ethelbert agreed to meet them outdoors, perhaps uncertain of these strangers, perhaps wary of their God. The monks, dressed in simple habits, processed with a cross and an image of Christ, chanting softly as they came, a far different sight from armed envoys or merchants with goods to trade. The king listened. His own wife, Bertha, was a Christian from the Frankish lands, and she had already prepared a small soil of familiarity for the gospel in his court. Augustine, drawing on the guidance and authority given him by Gregory, spoke not with violence or harshness, but with patient explanation. He did not force baptism, he invited. In time, Ethelbert accepted the faith, and with him many of his people. The ancient city of Canterbury became the center of this new Christian presence, and Augustine, its first bishop. Back in Rome, Gregory followed these developments with deep interest, like a father waiting for letters from children who have gone far away. When reports arrived of progress and difficulties, he responded with advice and consolation. His letters to Augustine as bishop are particularly revealing. They show a pope who is practical, patient, and wise, concerned not only with doctrine and discipline, but with how the gospel takes root in real places and real hearts. One of the most famous of these letters concerns the question of pagan temples and customs in the newly evangelized land. Some advise that all traces of the old religion be destroyed at once. Gregory thought otherwise. In his counsel, he suggests that the temples should not be demolished, but rather cleansed, their idols removed, and then consecrated as churches. The local people, he reasoned, were attached to these places. If those strong associations could be gently redirected toward the worship of the true God, the transition would be easier, the shock less severe. Similarly, he advised that certain outward practices, such as animal sacrifices, be transformed rather than entirely eliminated at first. Instead of sacrificing animals to idols, he suggested, the people could slaughter them in thanksgiving to God and share the meat in a communal meal. Step by step, their customs would be purified, their hearts gradually drawn from old fears and superstitions toward a freer, more trusting relationship with the Lord. Gregory's approach was not one of harsh erasure, but of patient transformation. He understood that grace often works gradually within cultures, baptizing what is good and gently healing what is harmful. This vision of evangelization, firm in truth, yet gentle in method, reveals the depth of his pastoral wisdom. Gregory did not imagine that the gospel could be imposed by force. He believed that it had to be proposed, explained, lived in a way that made its beauty visible. When he spoke of teaching the Anglo-Saxons, he emphasized the example of a holy life as much as the content of sermons. The monks had to embody what they proclaimed: charity, humility, patience, and a trust in God, even when progress seemed slow. His concern for distant peoples did not stop with the Anglo-Saxons. Gregory wrote to bishops and rulers in Spain, Gaul, and North Africa, urging them to reform abuses, to care for the poor, to strengthen the preaching of the gospel. He encouraged missions among the Lombards, whose presence in Italy had been a source of fear, but who were themselves in need of guidance and conversion. He sent letters across the Mediterranean and beyond, like small boats set upon a wide sea, carrying words of exhortation, correction, and hope. In all these efforts, Gregory saw himself as continuing the apostolic mission. Peter and Paul had once walked the roads of the empire. Now the successors of Peter were called to extend that journey through their envoys and letters. Gregory did not travel himself to Britain or to the distant courts he addressed, but in prayer and concern, he was present there. He carried these lands in his heart when he stood at the altar in Rome. His intercessions were not bounded by geography. They flowed quietly outward, seeking to embrace the whole church spread across nations and tongues. At the same time, he never forgot that evangelization begins at home. The mission to distant peoples would ring hollow if Rome itself did not strive to live the gospel. Thus, his efforts in charity, in reforming clergy, in guiding monks and lay people alike, were all part of the same vision. A city that cared for its poor, a clergy that lived in purity and simplicity, a pope who viewed himself as servant. These were themselves a kind of preaching, a witness that lent credibility to the missions abroad. Gregory's writings reflect this balance between contemplation and outreach. In his pastoral rule, he describes the qualities needed in those who lead souls: discernment, humility, patience, the ability to speak differently to different people according to their needs, the readiness to weep with sinners while still calling them to conversion. Such a shepherd, in his view, must be both gentle and firm, both rooted in prayer and active in service. It was this model he offered not only to bishops near him, but also, through his letters, to pastors in lands far beyond Rome. As news came back from the Anglo-Saxon mission that churches were being founded, that Easter was being celebrated where once only pagan rites had echoed, that monks were teaching the Psalms to new voices, Gregory's heart found a quiet joy. He did not see these events as his own triumph. He saw them as signs of God's mercy, given to a people who had long walked in another light. If he rejoiced, it was with the modest happiness of a man grateful to have played a small part in a much greater story. In the evenings, perhaps, after dealing with the endless matters of Rome's survival, Gregory might sit for a short while in a room lit by a single lamp, a letter from Britain or Gaul in his hands. The parchment, bearing news from far away, would tell of baptized kings, of newly built churches, of difficulties and setbacks. He would read slowly, lips moving silently over the words, and then lift his eyes for a moment, as if seeing beyond the walls of his city to wind-swept hills and wooden chapels under grey skies, where men and women were learning to pray the Our Father for the first time. In such moments, the world, with all its divisions and distances, must have seemed strangely small and interconnected. Rome, no longer the center of an empire in the old sense, had become a different kind of center, a source of prayer, teaching, and mission. Gregory, the reluctant pope who had longed to remain a monk, had allowed his heart to be stretched until it held not only his monastery and his city, but also distant peoples whose language he never spoke, whose faces he never saw. His vision of evangelization was neither triumphal nor impatient. It was the vision of a shepherd who believed that Christ's love could find its way, quietly and steadily, into every land, if only those who carried his name were willing to live humbly, to adapt wisely, and to trust deeply in grace. The wind that rustled the trees on the Caelian hill also swept across the fields of Kent and beyond. Under that same sky, Gregory's prayer reached, like a soft and unseen thread, binding together Rome and the far islands where the gospel was taking root. And so, while he walked the streets of a wounded city, Gregory's spirit moved along roads and shorelines far away. He was, in truth, a pastor to the whole world as he knew it, not by ruling from afar, but by serving, by sending, by encouraging, by loving, in a way that refused to be confined by geography. The same heart that fed the hungry in Rome rejoiced over newly baptized children in Britain. The same hands that signed orders for grain shipments also traced the blessing over letters of guidance to missionaries. In the quiet chambers where he prayed, the circle of his care widened until it embraced lands he would never touch with his feet, but would always hold before God with a shepherd's steady, enduring affection. In the midst of famine and plague, letters and negotiations, the endless cares of a city that always seemed to be on the edge of some new trouble, Gregory's life might have appeared to be consumed entirely by urgent tasks. Yet beneath and within these demands, there flowed a quieter, deeper work, the work of teaching souls. It was not enough in his eyes to feed the hungry and negotiate peace. Hearts also needed nourishment, guidance, and a way of seeing the world that could endure when everything seemed fragile. Out of this conviction rose some of his most enduring writings, texts that would echo softly through many centuries, the Pastoral Rule and the Dialogues. Gregory did not write as a distant scholar, seated in a calm library, far from the storms of daily life. He wrote as a man whose door was always being knocked upon, whose days were shaped by the cries of the poor, the questions of bishops, the anxieties of rulers. His words grew from experience, like plants rooted in a soil of real encounters and sleepless nights. When he took up the pen, he was not inventing theories. He was trying to share what he had learned in the hard school of shepherding souls. The Pastoral Rule began as an attempt to describe what kind of person a bishop, or any spiritual leader, ought to be. Gregory had not wanted the office he now held. Precisely for that reason, he felt compelled to reflect on its demands. If God allowed someone as fearful and reluctant as himself to become Bishop of Rome, then it was all the more urgent to clarify what such a role required. He did not imagine that this book would be read by future generations as a classic of Christian spirituality. He wrote it as a gentle yet firm mirror for pastors, a way of helping them examine themselves. He starts from a simple, sobering idea. Not everyone should rush toward positions of leadership in the church. The care of souls is a delicate task, and it can harm both shepherd and flock if undertaken without humility and preparation. Gregory warns against those who seek authority for honor, comfort, or influence. Such motives, he suggests, twist the office into something it was never meant to be. A pastor must be someone who has learned to govern himself before governing others, who has experienced inner struggle and conversion, who knows his own weakness and therefore does not judge others harshly. Yet he also acknowledges a different danger, that some who are truly called to leadership might shrink away from it out of fear, as he himself had done. The key is discernment. One must not run toward honors, nor flee from responsibility when God and the church clearly ask for it. The balance is subtle, and it requires a heart that listens more to God's voice than to the shifting winds of human praise or criticism. In this, Gregory speaks with the tremor of honesty. He does not present himself as a flawless guide, but as someone still learning the very lessons he is trying to teach. In the pastoral rule, he then turns to the qualities required of a shepherd. The list is long and demanding, yet always humane. A pastor must be rooted in contemplation, yet attentive to practical matters, gentle, yet capable of firmness when truth is at stake, patient with the weak, yet unafraid to confront wrongdoing, able to speak simply to the uneducated, yet also able to nourish those already advanced in the spiritual life. Above all, he must be a man of compassion, someone whose heart is tender toward the wounds of others because he knows his own. One of the most striking parts of the book is Gregory's insistence that a good shepherd must adapt his words to the condition of those he addresses. The same truth cannot always be spoken in the same way. To the proud, one must speak with a voice that gently lowers them. To the discouraged, with a tone that lifts and consoles. To the impulsive, with calm restraint. To the timid, with encouragement. Gregory provides long lists of contrasting types, rich and poor, joyful and sorrowful, married and celibate, rulers and subjects, and suggests how the same gospel should be presented differently to each. It is as if he stands in a church filled with many faces and tries to show future pastors how to let a single message fall into many hearts according to their need. In these pages, we see how deeply he understood the complexities of the human soul. He knew that people are not made of one simple material. They are woven of memories, fears, hopes, habits, and hidden wounds. A true pastor, in his view, is something like a physician who must diagnose carefully before prescribing treatment. Harshness given to a fragile soul can break it. Leniency given to a hardened heart can confirm it in its hardness. The art of guiding souls lies in discerning, with prayer, what each one can bear, and how best to lead them gently toward the light. Yet Gregory does not leave the pastor on a pedestal. He frequently reminds those in leadership that they remain sinners themselves. They must weep for their own faults, even as they weep for the faults of others. When they preach, they should hear their own words first, as an examination of their own conscience. If they fail, they must not despair, but return to God in humility, remembering that the Lord chose Peter, who denied him, to be the shepherd of his church. In this way, Gregory frames pastoral care not as the work of perfect men directing imperfect ones, but as the shared journey of wounded pilgrims. some of whom are asked to guide others while remaining always in need of grace themselves. While the pastoral rule speaks mainly to those in authority, the dialogues show another side of Gregory's teaching, his desire to nourish the imaginations and hopes of ordinary believers. In these books, written in the form of conversations with a deacon named Peter, Gregory gathers stories of holy men and women, especially from Italy. He describes their lives, prayers, struggles, and, according to tradition, the wonders associated with them. The tone of the dialogues is gentle and almost conversational. Peter asks questions. Gregory replies with narratives. He tells of abbots and hermits, bishops and simple lay people whose faith shone in difficult times. Some stories are quiet and interior, about patience in suffering, humility in leadership, or charity toward the poor. Others include accounts of visions, healings, or other extraordinary events that, according to the tradition of the time, accompanied their lives. Gregory does not present these tales as dry historical records. He offers them as examples, as windows through which his readers can glimpse what it looks like when a human life is slowly shaped by grace. In an age when many people were afraid of barbarian invasions, of disease, of poverty, of the uncertain future, the dialogues served as a kind of gentle lantern. They showed that God was still present, still active, not only in the distant times of the apostles, but in their own lands and years. Here were Italians, familiar with the same hills and rivers, enduring similar hardships, who yet lived in such friendship with God that their lives became signs of His closeness. The stories were not told to dazzle, but to reassure. Holiness was not an unreachable mystery. It was something that could blossom even in broken times, even in ruined cities, even in quiet villages touched by war. One of the most beloved sections of the dialogues is Gregory's account of Benedict of Nursia, the founder of Western monasticism. In describing Benedict's life, Gregory does not focus on grand achievements, but on the patient crafting of a community where prayer and work were woven together into a single offering. He tells of Benedict's wisdom in guiding monks, his discernment in dealing with difficult characters, his miracles of protection and healing, always in a tone that emphasizes Benedict's humility rather than any kind of spiritual spectacle. From these pages, later generations would come to know Benedict not only as a lawgiver of monks, but as a gentle father whose holiness radiated quietly through the mountain air of his monastery. The dialogues shaped Christian imagination in a special way. They gave people stories to carry in their minds and hearts, to tell by lamplight on long evenings, to repeat on journeys, to meditate upon in times of loneliness. Through these narratives, Gregory helped the faithful see their world as a place where heaven and earth were not far apart, where saints walked the same dusty roads and prayed under the same skies, where grace could appear in surprising ways, in a healing, in a prophetic word, in the sudden strength given to someone in trial. At the same time, he was careful. He did not suggest that every unusual occurrence was a miracle or that sanctity was proven simply by signs and wonders. For Gregory, the true measure of holiness was always charity and humility. Extraordinary events, when they occurred, were to be received with gratitude, but they were secondary. What mattered most was the steady turning of a heart toward God, the willingness to serve others, the patience to bear suffering without bitterness. His stories, even when they include marvels, always return quietly to these deeper virtues. In both the pastoral rule and the dialogues, we see Gregory forming not just doctrines, but a way of seeing. For pastors, he shapes a vision of leadership that is tender, attentive, and humble. For ordinary believers, he he offers a vision of the Christian life in which holiness is close at hand, intertwined with daily realities, neither distant nor reserved for a select few.
His writings are like gentle hands, taking the reader by the shoulder and turning them slightly, so that they can look at the same world with new eyes. The effect of his teaching is subtle, like the slow brightening of dawn. A bishop reading the pastoral rule might hear in its pages a call to examine his motives, to be more patient with the weak, to pray more before speaking.
A layperson hearing stories from the dialogues might begin to feel that the saints are not remote marble figures, but companions who understand fear and fatigue, who once faced similar worries and yet trusted God. In this way, Gregory's words worked quietly in countless hearts, encouraging a more merciful, hopeful, and attentive Christianity. In his own life, these teachings were not abstractions. When Gregory corrected a cleric harshly, perhaps he remembered his own counsel to speak differently to different souls. When he wrote to a distant bishop, he did so with the awareness that pastors everywhere shared his burdens. When he prayed in the stillness of night, he thought not only of Rome, but of all those whose imaginations and hopes his writings might touch. Monks in distant valleys, priests in small churches, lay people who carried within them secret struggles and hidden desires for God. As the years passed and his body grew more tired, the pen sometimes fell more heavily from his hand. Illness visited him, limiting his strength, slowing his movements. Yet the works he had already written continued their quiet journey, being copied by patient scribes, sent along roads and sea routes, arriving in monasteries and cathedrals far from the Caelian hill. Gregory's physical voice might falter, but his written voice lingered in places he would never see, whispering to generations he would never meet. In the dim light of his final years, he could not have known how long his words would endure, nor how many lives they would quietly shape. He only knew that in a world full of noise and fear, the soul needed guidance and gentle, truthful stories. His task, as he saw it, was to share what had been given to him, the insight born of prayer, the compassion born of suffering, the hope born of Christ's faithful presence. Thus, Gregory the Great, shepherd of a wounded city, also became a teacher of souls across time. In his pastoral rule, he traced the outline of a humble, attentive pastor. In his dialogues, he lit small lamps of story and example in the minds of believers. Through both, he helped the church learn to look at itself and its world with eyes of mercy, to see leadership as service, holiness as love, and history itself as a place where God moves quietly, patiently, drawing hearts toward a kingdom that no plague, no famine, no ruin can ever destroy. There are some lives whose influence does not shout across history, but moves through it with the softness of a psalm sung at dusk. Gregory's is one of these. He did not rebuild an empire, nor did he preside over an age of outward triumph. His years as pope were marked by ruin, danger, and exhaustion. Yet within that fragile frame of time, he wove something enduring and strangely gentle, a way of leading, a way of praying, a way of imagining the church that would echo long after his voice fell silent. In his later years, Gregory's body grew weaker. The illnesses that had troubled him for much of his life became more insistent. He suffered from pains that limited his movements, made writing difficult, and turned ordinary tasks into acts of endurance. Those around him would have seen the signs: slower steps, longer pauses, the lines of fatigue around his eyes. Yet his responsibilities did not recede. Rome still needed him. Letters still arrived, heavy with questions and appeals. The poor still waited at the doors of the church. It was in this tension between a frail body and a vast responsibility that the true texture of his humility became visible. He did not pretend to be strong. He did not hide his weakness behind a facade of grandeur. Instead, he allowed his suffering to shape his leadership, to make it more patient, more compassionate, more willing to admit dependence on God. In his writings, he compares himself to a man caught between the contemplative life he loved and the active life he had been compelled to embrace, lamenting that his mind was often pulled away from prayer by the anxieties of governance. Yet even in this lament, there is a quiet fidelity. He continued to serve, to pray, to write, to love, without demanding an easier road. The city around him too bore scars. Floods and plagues had left neighborhoods half empty, buildings damaged, families broken. The ancient structures of Roman administration were now interwoven with the pastoral care of the church. The Pope's residence was no glittering palace. It was more like a working house where prayer, administration, hospitality, and charity were constantly intertwined. Gregory presided over this life with a kind of domestic simplicity. He did not create a distant court of ceremony. He shaped a household of service. Within this household, one of the most subtle and lasting elements of his legacy was sound, the sound of chant. The tradition that links his name with what we now call Gregorian chant is wrapped in layers of later admiration and legend, yet at its heart lies something true. Gregory cared deeply about the liturgy, the church's prayer, offered in common, morning and evening, day after day. He understood that the words of the Psalms and the prayers of the Mass, when sung, could sink more deeply into the heart, carried along by melody like leaves on a gentle stream. He worked to order and refine the liturgical life of Rome, clarifying texts, arranging the sequence of readings, and, according to tradition, helping to shape the manner of singing that would come to bear his name. Whether he personally composed melodies, or rather encouraged and organized the tradition that others developed, the result was similar. A style of prayerful song that was simple, supple, and profoundly contemplative. The chant that grew in the Roman Church during and after his time was not theatrical or ornate. It moved in flowing, unhurried lines, gently lifting scripture into the air and letting it hover there, accessible to minds and hearts alike. Imagine a Roman church in Gregory's day, perhaps in the soft half-light before dawn or as evening gathered. A small group of clergy and monks stands in the choir, their voices joined in a single line of melody. There are no instruments, no complex harmonies, only the human voice, rising and falling. The Latin words of the Psalms, words Gregory knew almost by heart, unfold slowly, pleas for mercy, expressions of trust, memories of God's past deeds. In the back of the church, a few lay people kneel or sit quietly, listening, letting the music wrap around their worries like a gentle cloak. In this setting, Gregory's influence is not seen but heard. In the ordered flow of the Psalms, in the stability of the liturgical year, in the consistent pattern of readings and prayers that tethered Rome's fragile days to an eternal rhythm. The Church's prayer became, under his guidance, a kind of anchor for a society tossed about by events. Even if the streets outside were filled with uncertainty, within the walls of the churches there was a predictable and soothing pattern. Advent leading to Christmas, Lent to Easter. The feast days of martyrs and apostles returning each year like quiet friends. Over time, the chant associated with Rome spread outward, carried by monks and clergy to other lands. Centuries later, when choirs in distant monasteries and cathedrals would sing in that same gentle flowing style, they would be, in some sense, walking along a path Gregory had helped to clear. His name would cling to the music not because he sought it, but because his love for ordered, prayerful worship had left a mark on the church's memory. Yet his true music was not only in notes and melodies, it was in the tone of his humility. Gregory had every reason, by human standards, to consider himself important. He was Bishop of Rome at a time when the city depended heavily on papal leadership. His letters were read across continents. His decisions affected the lives of kings and peasants alike. And yet, whenever he spoke of his office, he did so with a kind of trembling. He famously described the Pope as Servus Servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God. It was not a poetic flourish, but a deliberate stance. He knew that authority in the church must be turned downward toward those most in need rather than upward toward personal honor. When he argued with other bishops who claimed titles he thought too exalted, his concern was not wounded pride. It was a fear that the church might forget the pattern of Christ, who washed the feet of his disciples. Gregory wanted a papacy that resembled that gesture, a leadership kneeling, cloth in hand, ready to cleanse and comfort. His humility was also visible in how he handled conflict and correction. In his letters, he could be firm, even sharp, when confronting injustice or negligence. Yet he always returned to the reminder that he too stood under judgment, that he too was a sinner in need of mercy. He asked for prayers from those he corrected. He did not set himself above them as a flawless judge, but beside them as a brother with a heavier responsibility. As his final years unfolded, Gregory's world remained full of worries. Negotiations with Lombard leaders, decisions about church property, efforts to support the poor, guidance to distant bishops and missionaries. The burdens did not lighten as his strength faded. But there is a kind of quiet nobility in the way he kept going, step by careful step, trusting that even small acts of faithfulness mattered. One can picture him seated at a table, shoulders slightly bent, a clerk beside him ready to write. He dictates a letter, perhaps to a bishop in Gaul who needs encouragement, or to the missionaries in Britain who seek advice, or to a local church administrator who must be reminded to treat the poor with gentleness. His words, shaped by scripture and long experience, move between firm instruction and tender counsel. When the letter is finished, it is sealed and entrusted to a messenger who will carry it along roads that Gregory himself will never walk again. Then he turns perhaps to the liturgy. Painfully, slowly, he makes his way to the church, where the community awaits. The psalms begin. As they are chanted, Gregory's voice joins them, maybe weaker now, maybe sometimes silent when pain overwhelms him, but present. The words he has prayed for decades are still on his lips, pleas for mercy, expressions of trust. Whatever the day has brought, whatever decisions have weighed upon him, here in the ordered prayer of the church, he finds once again the steady line of God's faithfulness running beneath the broken surface of history. His death came quietly, without spectacle. The date, March 12th of the year 604, is a fixed point in time, but the manner of his passing is remembered more by its atmosphere than its details. We can imagine a Rome that, by then, had grown accustomed to turning to Gregory in every crisis, suddenly feeling unusually vulnerable. The shepherd who had fed them, comforted them, negotiated for them, and taught them, had gone. Yet he had not left them empty-handed. He left a city more organized in charity, a clergy better formed, a liturgy more stable, a network of missions extending into new lands, and a body of writings that would continue to speak long after his own voice fell silent. In later centuries, Christians would look back and call him Gregory the Great. The title might have surprised him. By his own measure, greatness belonged to those who forgot themselves in love for God and neighbor, who embraced humility, who suffered for the sake of truth and mercy. Yet in precisely this sense, the name fits him. His greatness was not in conquest or display, but in a sustained hidden fidelity, the daily decision to serve, to pray, to bear others' burdens as far as his strength allowed. His influence spread quietly. Monks read his pastoral rule and examined their own motives for leadership. Bishops found in his letters a model for how to balance firmness and gentleness. Ordinary faithful drew comfort and inspiration from the stories in the dialogues. In distant monasteries, where dawn light filtered through narrow windows onto worn stone floors, voices rose in chant that owed something, in its very shape and calm, to the liturgical care of Gregory. Even today, when centuries have piled up like mist between his time and ours, his legacy can still be sensed wherever the Church seeks to serve the poor before herself, to pray before acting, to speak with compassion before judgment. Whenever a pastor examines his conscience about how he treats his flock, Gregory's questions are near. Whenever a community gathers to sing psalms in a simple, unhurried line, his love of ordered prayer is present. Whenever a Christian remembers that true authority is service, and that the greatest among us must be the servant of all, his example is quietly there, like a lantern in the corner of a dim room. If we step back and look at his life as a whole, what we see is not a straight, confident path, but a series of obediences. The noble child in a wounded city, the young prefect, the monk on the Caelian hill, the reluctant envoy to Constantinople, the even more reluctant pope, the weary yet faithful shepherd of a suffering Rome. At each stage, Gregory listened, hesitated, and then said yes. He did not choose his circumstances, but he chose again and again to respond to them with trust. And so his story comes to rest, not in a monument of stone, but in a more delicate place. The memory of a man who, in an age of collapse and confusion, believed that God was still present, still speaking, still calling. He believed that a ruined city could still be loved, that distant peoples could still hear the gospel, that pastors could still be shaped by humility, that song and prayer could still hold a community together when everything else seemed to fall apart. In the quiet of night, when Rome's streets were dim and the last lamps burned low, the chant of the church continued, soft but steady. Gregory's life, with all its trials and tenderness, had become something like that chant. A humble, continuous offering, rising from a wounded world to the heart of God, leaving behind, for all who came after, a gentle trace of what it means to lead, to serve, and to hope. If the quiet journey of St. Gregory has kept you company tonight, you are welcome to remain a little longer in the gentle light of his memory. If you wish, you can like this video and subscribe so that other nights may bring you the quiet stories of more saints and shepherds from long ago. And in the comments, you might share where in the world you are listening from, or which moment of Gregory's life touched you most. Your presence here is a gift, and we are grateful to keep watch with you in this calm hour.